Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, alumni, friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Eric from the NUS Development Office, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you here to our An Undefeated Minds Series Lunchtime Forum, jointly brought to you by the NUS Development Office, the Department of Psychological Medicine, and the Office of Alumni Relations. Our chair for this forum today is Associate Professor Yong. Ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands together and give Prof. Wong a warm round of applause.
A very good afternoon, Mr. Wee, Prof. Eric Taylor, Prof. Kwa, distinguished guests, colleagues from NUS campus. A very warm welcome to this afternoon's lunchtime talk. It's my pleasure now to introduce you to the speaker for this lunchtime talk. That is none other than Professor Eric Taylor. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to invite Professor Taylor to the rostrum. Please join me.
Well, good afternoon, dear colleagues, and thank you for the honour and the pleasure you're giving me to come and speak. And I hope to discuss and argue and to share perspectives about the changing place of mental problems in the modern world. And that's also a continuum of risk, because when we followed them up 10 years later, then the extent to which they had problems 10 years later, we didn't follow all 3,000 up, we followed up stratified groups. And then those with no problems had a modest risk of mental problems at 4%. But at each increasing level of severity, there was a higher risk for developing the problems. So there's a continuum of risk. And furthermore, what was developing was not only ADHD and those problems breeding true. What was happening, there were changes. It was a heterotypic continuity. The problems might just as well be conduct problems of antisocial and aggressive behaviour. Sometimes there were problems of anxiety. Sometimes there were problems of depression. So one problem was changing into another, and we had to think about it as a dynamic process, what I'm calling here a mediated developmental pathway, because we were seeing the genes, the variety of genes, many of which we now know, interacting to produce a child who's very restless and inattentive. But that had a strong effect on the child's environment, and that evoked anger, hostility, harsh punishment from other people. And that, in turn, was what evoked and led to the anxiety, the depression, and the aggressive problems that were appearing as a complication. An earlier issue in childhood would be the risk that comes from growing up in substitute care. Let's say not living with your family, but living in the care of the local authority. That's a big risk. And children coming out of care at the age of 16 are very vulnerable. They're often poorly educated. They often have very labile emotions. They're often not equipped, as a family life equips them, to deal with the problems of the world. But that's modifiable, because in this case, the raised risk of emotional disorder, the protective factor here turns out to be whether they've had a relationship with a non-exploiting adult around the time of this transition. It might be a youth leader, it might be a teacher. But if they had a personal relationship with somebody who is not abusive towards them, then that is a strong protective factor for their entering more unscathed into life. So again, the developmental science of taking people through a longitudinal course is giving us quite good clues about what we can do to modify that course and protect them from that particular risk. But that protection would only be the case for that particular risk. It's not a widespread protection against everything. We often think in terms of different kinds of protection. But anecdotally, I was finding when trying to look at a meditation program for young people, that the people who did best by far were the intelligent children who weren't themselves mentally upset or disturbed. Now, of course, it's helpful for them, but it didn't have much effect at all on the less bright children who found it hard to cope. So in that case, the high risk weren't getting the benefit from it. And the problem there is what's called the Matthew effect. which is if you apply it, then you're increasing inequality. The able become more able, the less able stay the same. So in terms of what happens in society, is that you've increased the difference between people, which is a paradoxical effect of some prevention attempts. Probably more important to us is this kind of pattern, which we're calling the stabilizing pattern. And for example, we put a lot of emphasis on parent training programs, which are training programs where parents who are having difficulties can learn skills of positive contact with children, learn skills of discipline with children, learn behavior modification techniques with children. And that helps a lot for the high-risk children. So for children who are themselves disruptive, it's a very valuable process. For children who are themselves intact, positive, developing well, it's really not, there isn't any one good way of bringing up children. Most families do just fine. And the knowledge of this helps us to say to families, what we're teaching in parent training isn't what would be right for everyone, it's just what would be right for a child who's having bad mental problems. So understanding the way that the protective factors are operating is a very helpful guide in thinking how you deploy them in practice. So in this talk, I've been trying to go over a number of what I think of as more modern risks, and what the science is saying about what things may be useful in protection and conferring resilience on the children. We've mentioned the conflict and the moderation of that by the child and by the parents. We've mentioned the diet, not very promising so far. We've mentioned substance misuse and the issues that can come in. We've talked about positive psychology, the universal interventions, about noticing the positive, remembering positive things. Positive psychology in schools, I think, is increasing substantially here. And construing failure as learning rather than personal failure. We've had randomized control trials for school classes about media pressure, about parent support and training interventions. Skills learning and peer advice for substance abuse. We've talked about reducing punishment for failure and promoting acceptance and positive attitudes. I think the next stage is going to be going on to more series of randomized control trials, which are the gold standard of whether we're actually helping. Because children now, as always, will make their own world, and they'll make a different world from the one that parents intend for them. And in preparing them for the new world, we don't know what that world is going to be. We don't know what the values are going to be. We don't know what they'll have to learn. But I think that we can, nevertheless, go further than Rousseau was saying about protecting them from the cruelty of the world. We can actually encourage resilience, and often it will be in many small ways, and recognising the variety of risks rather than one big overall approach. That's my final message, and thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion and argument.
I think Dr. Amy Chua brought up her own personal experience of how she parented her two daughters, of believing that a regime of no play dates, no TV, no computer games, and hours of music practice would create happy kids. And of course, in her article, she was sharing her own growing up experience as well as her own experience bringing up her two daughters into two different parenting styles of so-called the Chinese mother. In effect, she did qualify that she refers to the Asian mothers, which includes Korean mothers, Taiwanese mothers, Japanese mothers as well, versus so-called the westernized mother. And her profiling of the two parenting styles, essentially, we are quite familiar with. One is really demanding the child to practice what the parent feel is important, that is, to do well in the areas that they are good at, they are gifted at, as well as to be able to excel in academic studies, versus the so-called her description of a Western parenting style of allowing the child to develop independently with creativity as well as strong self-esteem and be successful in their own right. And I think I'd just like to invite Prof. Taylor to comment on this.
Yes, it's very interesting. It's created a lot of interest in England as well, from a rather different perspective. Because I mean, we often wish that we were more like Singapore. That we had a better ordered system in schools, and that we had a stronger pressure on achievement. I've got nothing to say really that I can defend the English system, because we do manage to combine low achievement and unhappiness in our children, in a way that we do very urgently need to tackle and improve as a society, and we are thinking about that. I think that well, first of all, it depends on the child, because huge pressure and the highest of expectations are terrific for an able child. But there are genetic differences between people. There are different things that people can be successful at. And if you only have one standard of what's successful, and if that standard is your exam grades in academic subjects at school, then it's going to be rotten for those kids, who by their nature are not going to be successful at it. But those kids may very well, and usually will, have something else that they can be excellent at. It may be sport, it may be art, it may be music, it may be one of a dozen things. It may be negotiating, it may be selling. The excellence comes in many forms. So I think that to have a one-dimension focus on only achieving in one thing, I think that's bad. Not for the kids who can do it. It's great for them, and the achievement and happiness go together, and they're pressured and they achieve their potential, and it's terrific. But I think it's bad for the kids who can't, because they just feel rotten about themselves, and then they opt out or they find ways of escaping from it.
Please join me to thank Professor Taylor for a very elegant presentation. And a very candid Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you.